Let's get started then. Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us wherever you are. And especially thanks to our panelists who are joining us today from different time zones. In Stockholm, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It's already dark outside. I hope it's not the case where you are, maybe. My name is Emil Edenborg. I work as a researcher at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And before introducing our panel, I will say a few words on the questions that we will be addressing during this hour that we have together. The rights of LGBTIQ people have become a contested and controversial issue in international politics. Activists and advocates have made very important victories in recent years, both in national context and on international levels, when it comes to issues of SOGIESC. SOGIESC is an acronym which stands for sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics, which we might be using today. So repressive laws have been removed in certain places. Important rights have been secured in many places. At the same time, however, all over the world, people are being discriminated, excluded, harassed, in some cases killed because of sexual orientation or gender identity. And there are many signs of increased resistance in many places. We've seen worrisome examples from Poland and Hungary, Chechnya, Tanzania, and opposition movements seem to be getting more well-organized and more globally interconnected. And activists in contexts where rights are being attacked often ask for international support, need international support from other activists, from international organizations, from states. So such support is incredibly important, but it also raises issues concerning what strategies of support and cooperation are the most efficient and responsible. What are the risks involved for activists? Can creating visibility and attention around these issues even put LGBTIQ people at more risk? How can, maybe most importantly, how can the activists on the ground be in control of support? So we will focus on this relation between LGBTIQ activists and international actors in this panel. And I'm very happy to introduce our panelists today. We have Caroline Kwasiama, who is the executive director of ISTAU, which is an activist-led fund working to support movements working for gender diversity and sexual rights in West Africa. I'm sure we'll say a few more words about the organization's work. We have Janar Sekerbayeva, who is the co-founder of Kazakhstan feminist initiative Feminita, which focuses on promoting the rights of marginalized women in Kazakhstan, including LGBT women. We have Her Excellency Ann Linde, Minister of Foreign Affairs in Sweden. It's a great honor to have you here, Foreign Minister. Thank you very much for taking your time to join us today. And we are also very happy to have Neela Ghoshal, who is the Associate Director of the LGBT Rights Program at Human Rights Watch, joining us today. And to our audience who are with us today, as you listen to this conversation, please ask your questions as you listen. Use the Q&A function. And we will be collecting questions, and towards the end we will try to have time for as many questions as possible from you. And you can choose to ask your questions anonymously or not in the function. So first, I'll turn to you, Caroline, to get a sense of what are the issues at stake. What are the important issues that we are talking about here? What would you perceive as major trends in the region you're working in, that is in Western Africa, trends that are positive or negative as regards the rights of LGBTIQ people? And how does your organization work to address these issues?
Thank you very much, Anya. Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. As you mentioned, my name is Caroline Kwasi. I'm the Executive Director of ISDAO, which stands for Initiative Sankofa d'Afrique de l'Ouest. ISDAO is an LGBTQI West African activist fund. And for us, that means that activists from within our community are involved in all levels of decision making around how we do our work, what we do, where we do, and around resourcing the movement. And I think resourcing is a really key piece. And when I'm talking about resourcing, not only around money, but other ways of resourcing and supporting movements within our region. West Africa is a complex region. It's a difficult one to talk about in a few minutes. There are 16 official countries, depending on whose definition. Between 15 and 17, we use a definition of about 16 countries. There's a lot of variation across the countries and even within the countries in general, but even more so when we talk about the context of SOGIESC work and organizing. But I want to try to talk about that in two quick ways, and also how ISDAO's work responds to that. When we were setting up ISDAO about 4 or 5 years ago, we thought it was we were responding to what we saw as a dearth of resources in the region, a real lack of resources supporting organizing in a way that responded to community priorities. And we conducted a mapping in 9 countries and found that while a lot of the resources that were, and I talk about resources here, funding but in general programs, were very focused on HIV and HIV-related programming. There was some work for advocacy, but it was very narrowly focused. And when we spoke with community organizations about what their priorities were, what we learned was actually there was a mismatch between where there were resources and what community priorities were. So priorities such as safety, security, addressing homelessness, addressing poverty, family rejection, violence, discrimination, not only around HIV, but in general around healthcare, but also social discrimination, were really high on the list of what groups were identifying as key issues that they wanted to work around and key issues facing community members in everyday lives. And this was across 9 countries. We work in 9 focal countries within the region. And we've also been learning a lot about what's happening too and what the needs are through our grant making process. So we have an open call that allows community-led organizations to define what they see as priorities and what they need funding for. And in analyzing our data over the last 2 years of grant making, what we've realized is that we're getting the most requests for support around addressing broadly stigma and discrimination, doing human rights education, working with families, trying to change social norms, access to health, not just around HIV, but broader mental health support, trans-specific health, and institutional strengthening and core support. And those may sound like jargony words, but what it means at the core is support for organizing, support for spaces of organizing, support for places where people can come and be together and think and strategize as a really key need. We work in a context of criminalization, of stigma and discrimination, like many parts of the world. And even, I think it's important to note that even in countries in our region where there's no laws on the books specifically criminalizing based on sexuality, that does not necessarily mean that everything is perfect. We do have a lot of de facto criminalization. There's still a lack of protection. So the lack of criminalizing laws does not necessarily mean it's a better context for LGBTQI communities. It just means there are certain dynamics that are different. What we've seen broadly in our context is also sometimes the attack around SOGIESC is not always direct, but often it's framed in the framing of protection of the family, retaining cultural values or traditional values. There's a trend of broader anti-rights campaigns that we're seeing across the region that are not only anti-LGBTQI, but anti-comprehensive sexuality education, anti-reproductive rights. And so there's those kinds of forces that we're also resisting against. And I talked a little bit about ISDAO in the beginning, but the way in which we intervene, the way in which we respond is by resourcing through funding, through grant making, through capacity strengthening, through creating opportunities for activists from different countries, across 9 countries to meet, to connect, to share strategies, to learn from each other, because we feel like that's also a part of resourcing, is actually creating spaces, and that's an important part of the work that we do. So I'll stop here, but I'm happy to answer other questions about the region later in the Q&A or at any other point in time.
Thank you so much for speaking about your relation to activists and your strategist, and also a little bit about the regional context of criminalization and anti-rights actors. I'll turn to Janar Sekirpaeva, you are a co-founder of a feminist and LGBT organization in Kazakhstan. And if I ask you a similar question, could you speak something about the general context in the region you're working in, trends, achievements, setbacks as regards LGBTIQ rights in Kazakhstan and maybe broader in Central Asia, and a little bit about how your organization addresses those issues?
Yeah, thank you very much. I represent Kazakhstan Feminist Initiative, who works mainly, focusly on LGBTQ women. Although we do not have trans women in our team, but we are great allies of transgender initiative in Almaty. That is why usually we connect with each other, collaborate, and do common advocacy. The general situation in Kazakhstan, I just imagine that you can hear about Kazakhstan, that this is a very rich country, which, pronounced itself as a very tolerant country with a lot of natural resources and so on. But if you see to the real picture, you can find that we have a lot of silence about some topics. And one of the topic of that could be LGBTQI people in Kazakhstan, which live for now are silenced or even not pronounced by high officials. So there is a picture when, for example, some authorities present some information about country, they even cannot pronounce LGBT. So they try to use another words or synonyms. I don't know what is happening with their mouth, but yeah, it's very interesting. The situation with LGBTQ plus people in Kazakhstan is very, I think it can be common with whole post-Soviet countries like Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. Although we have, of course, a lot of nuances. We have big stigmatization, and also we have, how to say, we have in the law the kind of formulation about lesbianism or sodomy. So in which our government, if they want to, they can punish you because of your relation, because of your sexual orientation or gender identity. The most maybe horrifying thing in Kazakhstan still is the very bad practice, unhuman practice with surgical corrections regarding transgender community. So Kazakhstani government actually requires everybody from trans community to do surgical interventions, and they are not like, you cannot choose. You are obliged, you have to, if you want to have new documents, and if you are a trans person, you have to do that exchange. You have to give your body autonomy in order to have new documents. And this is still continuing from, I don't know, 90s. We cannot change this procedure, although transgender initiatives really did great work. Together, for example, in 2016, for the first time for Kazakhstan, we achieved the recommendations from UN committees about that Kazakhstan should include sexual orientation and gender identity in the legislation as prohibited categories for discrimination. But still, 2020, we do not see any changes. Still, deputies or I don't know how officials cannot even pronounce LGBT. What we see to other groups, lesbian, bisexual, queer people, and gay, we also see a big stigmatization. Sometimes we receive a lot of stories and they are published on LGBT-friendly website Koktim and our website Feminita.kz. And that stories are about families which do not accept their children. Some of them actually use some kind of conversion therapy, which is now a big question. And for example, we know that there is a new, wave to prohibit that kind of therapy. It will be prohibited in many European countries which still use that. But in Kazakhstan, it exists in some way of hidden way. You cannot find it officially, but it is still existing. All practices when you take your children, LGBT children or youth, to mullah, to our religious, representatives, to make them heal from LGBT, I don't know how they call it, illness maybe. So we have a lot of that kind of stories. And because of the existing concept of shame, we call it uyat in Kazakh, we have that kind of, what people will say about you, what your neighbor will say about you. And this idea or somehow cultural concept actually do not allow family to accept their children maybe faster than they could be, or, it spread more stigmatization on any children, not only LGBT, but any, physical specificities. I mean, if you are not just heterosexual, healthy, you are out of that kind of framework. And what I wanted to say that recently we see in Kazakhstan anti-gender movement trends. We see how government try to eradicate gender and change it to equality of men and women. So in that kind of framework, of course, we cannot speak about LGBT anymore. And after our research, which, for example, our colleague Altanay Kambekova did, we found that this agenda actually comes from, some alt-right parties, for example, like in Germany, which also include neo-fascist points. And it's so contradictory when Kazakhstan says, we do not follow any Western agenda. We resist. But if you dig, you can see that Kazakhstan actually follow very shameful agenda of some Western political parties, or I don't know, some practices which can be used for eradicating LGBT people. Thank you.
Thank you for also raising the international context here. And if I could turn to you or continue asking you the question of international actors, or as an activist, what international support would you say is needed or would be required and would be helpful in your struggles? If you were to advise, say, states and international organizations on the best strategies to support your movement, what would that be?
Yeah, this is very key point for, I think, many LGBT initiatives or individuals who do their activism in Kazakhstan, because we cannot register our organizations. For example, our own Feminita initiative, our registration was interrupted for third time. We cannot exist officially, and so for our international partners, usually we try to be very careful about non-colonial approach. So we ask our partners not to, dictate some kind of, view, wide view on local context or local narratives that could exist, of course, in Central Asia. We also ask them for supporting non-registered organizations, because in Kazakhstan it's a very actual issue. Usually we use fiscal partnership as a mean for our, providing activities, conducting researches. We have to ask fiscal partners in other countries, for example, in Kyrgyzstan. Also, we would like to ask international donors to understand that sometimes documentation which is required is a very hard process for many activists who just starting their initiatives to follow that very hard level documentation, which only professional accountant can do for, you know, like well done. But for many activists, this is a really hard process. Another thing that I would like to mention, sometimes we also want to ask what actually not only we require from international partners, but also how we can help you, because maybe we could speak in, you know, both ways rather than just one way.
Thank you very much. Caroline, if I ask you the same question briefly, could you say something about like what role you envision for international actors? What is important? What is perhaps not important?
Yes, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, so I won't add. I mean, I think it's really important for international partners to examine and not be afraid of talking about issues of power. And I think that means examining within their institutions how power affects their own structures, what are the challenges that they have within their organizations, and being transparent about that. I think being very mindful about how power is being shared. So oftentimes what we see as a regional organization and our local partners is that international actors come with projects already designed, developed, they have an idea, it doesn't reflect the local context, and we may be consulted, but that's at the end. It's not at a design stage. And I think there's really important, you know, how do we share power even around conceptualizing ideas, around designing projects? How can they be more participatory in decision-making and strategy setting, not just at the consultation after things have already been developed? That sharing, looking at power internally, but also looking at how power can be shared, I think is also really important. I think, you know, another key thing is for those that are funding, that we're international actors that are funding flexibly, funding core work beyond projects is particularly important. Funding collective work, including coalitions, consortiums where they exist. And I saw there was actually a question for me around that. But I think it's also really important to not create new structures. And that was one of the things that we've seen that has really been detrimental in our region, is that a lot of funding and support from international organizations has created organizations and has actually contributed to tensions and fracturing within our movements. So it's, I think, being mindful of what's there and how to support what's there, rather than creation of new things and creation of new structures is another really key thing. The last very quick point I would make is that it's important to look beyond the silos. I think there's you know, where are there opportunities for international actors who may not be specifically focused on SOGI-SE issues or LGBTQI issues, that are working on civic participation, that are working on access to housing, access to employment. You know, there's a big conversation around humanitarian aid and the ways in which LGBTQI communities have been left out of that conversation. So how can international partners also start to think and encourage their peers to think about SOGI-SE issues, not only when we're talking about LGBTQI, but when we're talking about other international development, other civic space, other civil society issues? I think that's really key, and moving outside of the silos, because our lives are not just about our sexual orientation, gender identity, or sex characteristics.
Thank you very much. Thank you, both of you. Foreign Minister Linda, in what ways can a state like Sweden support the rights struggles of LGBTIQ activists? And what are Swedish priorities? We've heard of some of the issues that these particular activists are raising, and also their thoughts about and experience about international support. How does this kind of resonate?
Well, thank you. Sweden's position is crystal clear. Human rights are universal and applies to all. And we are all entitled to the same human rights, irrespective of whom we love, our sexual orientation, or our gender identity. As a foreign minister, I actively work to improve the respect for LGBTI persons' enjoyment of human rights. The government's drive for democracy and feminist foreign policy gives special emphasis to the situation of LGBTI persons. We have different tools in our toolbox. We work to influence and change behavior by repeatedly addressing states' obligation to ensure human rights to LGBTI persons. We do this bilaterally and multilaterally, including in EU and United Nations. We work together with our Nordic and Baltic neighbors, cross-regionally, of course, as a part of EU. And we also take active part in different platforms and working groups, such as the Equal Rights Coalition and the LGBTI Core Group. At the current UN General Assembly, we successfully presented the Nordic resolution on extrajudicial executions, where the vulnerable situation for LGBTI persons was especially highlighted. The EU recently adopted the Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy for 2020 to 2024, and Sweden will be active in its implementation, not least when it comes to ensuring the enjoyment of human rights by LGBTI people. Sweden also strongly supports the UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Another tool is, of course, our development cooperation. We provide direct support to a number of partners who are working globally, regionally, and bilaterally with these issues, including human rights defenders organizations, LGBTI and women human rights person are also very important because it's among our priorities. The situation for LGBTI persons is highlighted in the country reports on human rights, democracy, and rule of law. That is a very, very few countries. I think it's less than a handful who publish these kind of reports on the webpage. So it's for everybody to see. Thank you.
I was muted. What do you perceive to be the biggest challenges, the most difficult or challenging aspects in this work, Foreign Minister?
Well, actually, democracy has declined globally, and the space is shrinking for the civil society. And human rights defenders, and that is including LGBTI persons' enjoyment of human rights, are facing greater resistance linked to the rise of populist, fundamentalist, and violent extremism, but also increased resistance from state actors. This is extremely worrisome, not least for the fact that human rights defenders are critical for promotion and protection of human rights, but also for upholding democracy and respect for the rule of law and demanding accountability. It should be noted that women defenders often face additional obstacles and risks simply by being a woman. And it's therefore paramount that we ensure the gender perspective, which we do through our feminist foreign policy. And that goes, of course, for transgender women as well. It is perhaps more important than ever that we stand up for agreed commitments and advances to make sure that our standards are not weakened. It is therefore important to considerably bring up state responsibility to ensure the respect for human rights for all persons in all countries at all times. Another challenge is the fact that stigmatization and violence against LGBTI persons is increasing in the wake of the pandemic. To be effective and to be sustainable, measures combating the pandemic must comply with international law, human rights norms and rule of the law, even if it is acceptable to put in some restrictions because of the pandemic. The fact that we see widespread impunity for violations and even killings of LGBTI persons is totally unacceptable. And we will continue to address this as a matter of urgency.
Thank you very much. Last year, Foreign Minister, you were at our institute and spoke about priorities in Swedish foreign policy. And in that speech, you mentioned Sweden's work with LGBTIQ rights in Uganda as an example of where silent diplomacy or silent work conducted outside of the kind of media spotlight was needed rather than, say, open, loud criticism. And this maybe pertains to the question, to the issue that I raised in the beginning about how visibility and attention is often something that activists seek and need to address their issues, but the wrong kind of attention may also create a risk of backlash, perhaps, or put people at risk. So, is there a balance to strike here for a state like Sweden who are working with these issues, and how does Sweden navigate this dilemma?
Well, when working with fulfilling the human rights, including LGBTI rights, we have to strike a balance between vocal criticism and what can be called silent diplomacy. Country-specific situation in combination with advice and guidance from our local partner is helpful to know what is effective and what is possible in a given context. One concrete example is that I insist to meet with local LGBTI organization when I travel. But we are always careful to listen to how such meeting can be arranged without putting the organization or the members at risk. For example, my organization that has been really harassed and even put into jail. When I was in Tanzania, I met the LGBTI organization. They had a really terrible situation, and it would be really difficult for them to even tell anybody that they have met with me. And that is most important. Not important for me in this case always to say I have done this or I have met this person. It's always from the situation, from the persons and the country. We follow this situation globally very closely, and it of course include not the least Uganda, where we remain deeply concerned about the difficult situation for the LGBTI persons and the discrimination they face. Same-sex relations are illegal, can be punished with lifetime imprisonment. Discussing about introducing the death penalty will surface every now and then. And in the Ugandan context, as well as in some other countries, close and continuous dialogue with civil society representatives has been essential to understand how Sweden can best support the LGBTI community in a helpful way without the risk of being counterproductive or putting people at risk. So in the conversation I have had with human rights defender in Uganda, they at times recommend that we refrain from acting publicly as it could risk a hardening public discussion and worsen the situation for LGBTI persons. We of course adhere to the advice and instead use our diplomatic channels to convey our concern to Ugandan government representatives and discuss the ability for LGBTI persons to fully enjoy their human rights. But I want to emphasize that silent diplomacy in the Uganda case does not mean that we are silent. Simply that we act in other ways without telling it out loud. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Foreign Minister. I'll turn to Neela Ghoshal from Human Rights Watch next. We have heard many different, both national, regional, and international issues have been raised in regarding Lgbtiq issues. What would you say could you briefly say something about global trends? What do you regard as the most significant, both achievements and setbacks regarding the rights of LGBTIQ people in recent years?
Yes, thank you very much, Emil, and thank you to all the previous presenters. I've learned a lot from your remarks. I wanted to make 5 points on trends that I have taken note of working on these issues over the last 10 years or so. The first point is that we're winning the battle on decriminalization. That's a clear area of progress in this struggle. There have been 10 countries that have decriminalized consensual same-sex conduct in the last 10 years. And I believe 1 or 2 that have criminalized, but one of them later went back and reversed criminalization again. So this is exciting. This is something that the movements have been pushing for around the world for many years. And when I first started working in these movements, we had, I think, close to 80 countries that were criminalizing consensual same-sex conduct, and now we're down to below 70. So that is exciting, and that's momentum that certainly needs to be sustained, because criminalization does have both direct and indirect impacts on people's ability to enjoy their human rights, people's recognition as kind of part of the body politic in their countries, as people who are not second-class citizens, as well as on access to services and resources. The second point I want to make is that we're also making progress on gender identity, but this is being met by a very fierce pushback in a way that we are no longer seeing with regard to criminalization. And so there needs to be a strong focus on issues around gender identity and legal gender recognition. And in fact, when we look at things like violence, most of the cases of violence that we're documenting around the world now tend to be violence against trans and gender nonconforming people, which is not to suggest that people who are more gender conforming, gay, lesbian, and bisexual people are free from the risk of violence. Of course they're not, but we tend to sometimes talk about LGBT people in country X being at risk of violence, and we need to keep in mind that it's often actually trans people that we're speaking about and gender nonconforming people. So we need to think about how to refocus our efforts to uphold the right for transgender people to exist. And the progress that's being made, you know, part of it is with regard to laws like, you know, what Janar is mentioning, she would like to see in Kazakhstan, right? A law that would allow transgender people to change their documents, their name and gender marker on official documents, without being subjected to a whole series of bureaucratic and sometimes medical and surgical obstacles. So that's one area in which we need to see progress. But it's also concerning that we're seeing a sort of sliding back in countries like the UK, like the US, countries that had made progress on transgender rights, where there are now movements questioning whether trans women are women, for instance. And so there's a strong need for solidarity between women's movements and trans movements to push back and say that these voices saying that trans women are not women are not representative of any form of feminism. The third point that I want to make relates to the second point, and that is that the anti-gender movement is a force to be reckoned with. It has become, and it's been mentioned by most of the previous speakers, it has become globalized so that we see connections between Hungary, Brazil, the US, Kenya. There are people from fundamentalist groups and resources moving between these different locations, challenging what they call gender ideology. And this is, I think, the key battleground where our movements stand right now. The people who say that they are opposing gender ideology are opposing any deviation from lives that are based around rigid gender binaries, right? So their premise is that there are male and female bodies, and those bodies correlate to gender roles, and those gender roles correlate to what kind of relationships we're supposed to have, how we're supposed to express ourselves and present in society. And so we need to push back against these anti-gender movements by understanding them as holistically attacking everything ranging from same-sex relations to the existence of intersex people to the ability of women to enjoy their reproductive and sexual rights. All of these things are connected. We need to connect our struggles in order to fight back against this. Related to that, I think I just inadvertently linked my third and fourth point, so I'm going to leave my numbering system behind. But related to that is that there's a certain extent to which we need to own the charge of gender ideology. Now that might not mean we put on a hat and say I support gender ideology, but we need to understand that what they are accusing us of when they say that we promote gender ideology is equality and liberation. And so to a certain extent, we do believe in gender ideology, right? We want people to be free from these rigid gender binaries, and we need to focus our organizing around that principle. And that means centering trans voices. That means centering non-binary voices. That means centering women's voices. All of these voices, by the way, have been underfunded. And so trans-led and intersex-led and women-led groups need funding. And that means connecting our struggles to struggles for sexual and reproductive rights. And the fifth point that I want to make on trends, and this is to some extent a challenge to our movements, we are, I think, relying too much on certain oversimplified solutions to our problems. And one of those solutions is resorting to criminalization and a sort of approach that relies on the carceral state to find solutions to anti-LGBT violence and discrimination. And so while, of course, there's a unified call among our movements for laws that prohibit discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics, in some places that call has taken the form of a call for criminalization of discrimination. And indeed, a number of countries do criminalize discrimination with penalties of imprisonment for individuals who discriminate. There are calls for criminalization of conversion therapy. So not just bans, but criminalization and prison sentences. There are calls for criminalization of genital mutilation, which is how some people describe surgeries, non-medically necessary surgeries on intersex children. I think there's a pretty clear sense of agreement that all of these things need to be banned and fought against, but when we embrace criminalization as the solution, we need to think about how consistent that is with broader concepts of human rights and what it does to our movements when our solution is that states should put people in prison for violating our rights. What are we saying about the role of states? And also, are we taking the onus off of states to find broader and more creative solutions to fighting social stigma if we allow the kind of doctrine of individual criminal responsibility to take over? So that's a thought about kind of ways in which we need to more creatively rethink our solutions to the problems that confront us. I'll stop there. I could speak more about kind of specific issues in specific countries that we're working on at Human Rights Watch, but I think I can also address those in the Q&A.
Excellent. Yeah, we would like to have some time more for questions, but could you speak briefly about the issue of international actors specifically, and in what ways, from your experience or from your perspective, are efficient and good ways to support LGBTIQ activists, and are there strategies that are that you would advise not to undertake?
Yeah, so with regard to the role of international actors, I wanted to appreciate, first of all, the framing of some of the questions for this webinar. For instance, the questions focused on how should international actors uphold the rights of LGBTIQ people? And so I wanted to point out that there's an important distinction in framing between talking about the rights of LGBTQI people and LGBT rights, of course, or LGBTQI rights. I work within a program that calls itself the LGBT rights program at Human Rights Watch, but when we're doing the work on the ground, we need to understand that there's not a distinct special set of rights that are called LGBT rights, and we need to portray that very clearly in our interactions with advocacy targets. And so, for instance, when governments are engaged in diplomacy with rights violating governments, it needs to be clear that we're talking about things like the right to be free from torture, the right to the highest attainable standard of health, the right to non-discrimination, and not to kind of come in with a rhetoric of country X is violating LGBT rights and needs to be sort of corrected. I very strongly agree with and emphasize what both Caroline and Shanar have said about the need to avoid a sense that global North countries are imposing a sort of neo-colonial vision of how governments need to behave and how they need to treat their people, because that can clearly be very counterproductive. I really appreciate the Swedish idea of feminist foreign policy, because I think that if support for the rights of LGBTQI people is integrated into a feminist foreign policy that is holistic and that is also anti-racist and anti-imperialist, and that looks at things like economic and social rights as part of the body of rights that everybody is entitled to enjoy, we will make much more progress, and we'll also be able to bring many more allies on board. As Caroline has pointed out, there are urgent needs like shelter, housing, mental health. These are needs that are, in some cases, specific to LGBTQI populations, but in other cases, where many of the countries that we're working in, people across identity groups are facing challenges, right? Finding safe and sustainable housing, finding access to mental health services. And so to the extent, to which international stakeholders can support these kinds of services, both for LGBTQI people and for the population at large, I think that's likely to meet immediate needs that are really important to meet, and also to recognize that the rights of LGBTQI people don't exist in a vacuum, and that there is this broader context in many cases of various forms of marginalization and underdevelopment that the Global North directly contributed to, that it now needs to undo in the service of all people, not just LGBTQI people.
Thank you very much. We have gotten a lot of questions from our listeners, which is, I'm really happy about that. We will not have time to address all of them, but we'll address some of them. And I also hope that you will have a very short opportunity to very shortly reflect upon if there are things that you have heard from the other speakers that you would like to address. Feel free to do so. But I'll ask Caroline and Janar. I think Nila mentioned the importance of building coalitions, and especially building the need for alliances between feminist movements and LGBTIQ movements. Could you speak a little bit about your experiences of that? Has that been an easy task in your regions, or have you faced exclusion or unwillingness to be associated with your issues? Caroline, would you like to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm really happy that question is a part of this conversation. I think in a lot of cases, it's slow work. It's very slow work. Oftentimes what we've seen is where it has been because of one or two individuals rather than institutions. And I think we need to be mindful of that. Building coalitions between organizations, between movements, it's slow work. And oftentimes it takes that one person and a women's rights organization who gets it, who gets those connections, who is an ally, or who's a community member, and that can help to build those bridges. And I've seen it happen, but it is slow work, and it's not just putting people in the same room or building coalitions. And I also just really want to emphasize my last point around in my earlier points around not creating new structures as international partners, but how, where there are opportunities to create spaces for people to interact and to connect around shared ideas and shared principles or shared challenges. I think that's incredibly important. I think we have a lot of examples in our region of where it is happening and where it has happened. But as I mentioned, a lot of times it's certain individuals or particular moments that spark, whether it's a protest around police brutality or, a protest around violence against women, that sparks something. And so I think we need to look for the sparks, and we need to look for those individuals who are willing to step out of it and support their organizing and support that space. That's what I would say. But I do think we have a lot of examples of that across West Africa, but even more broadly across the African feminist movement. And I think we just don't always talk enough about it. But I think it's happening, and it's happening in different ways.
Thank you very much. Jana, could you briefly say something to this?
Sorry. I agree with Caroline that it is very slow work, and actually building that coalitions requires resources and time, and sometimes we have very different understanding of what to be activists themselves, for example, or how to be ally for somebody, and so on. We try to work very closely to women movement in Kazakhstan and with human rights NGO, but we see sometimes how also we're very different in, for example, disagreeing with the state solution or with this negotiation with the state. We see how generational difference always, always going forward. Because, for example, I don't know, maybe the generation of my mom and dad, they try to, collaborate with state more and understand and forgive. But I think the time of that is actually finished. And we try to be not like to say radical, just not agreeing, but radical in our solution. When, for example, Ministry of Justice trying to convince feminist initiative to take from the charter words like sex workers or political changes, and we do not agree. We will stand on our position that we need that phrases, we need that words, because these words are meaningful. And what I want to say that in Kazakhstan also, we also, feel the lack of sometimes of solidarity, but we learning how to. It's not easy process. We are Central Asian countries doesn't mean we are Central Asians, sisters or anybody else. It means also to learn how to be together. Even we are bordering to each other, we have very different sometimes views, and some conflicts inside could happen. And we try to speak on them, and we organize our platform. Now it is online, but we're happy to have it online and try to speak on that issues. And I see sometimes how, what I want just to mention, that international, for example, trans activism really shapes, I do not value it now, but it really shapes trans activism in Central Asia. So, and it has actually both income, positive and also negative too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Foreign Minister Linda, we have received many questions. I'll ask you two questions and try to see if you can address them briefly, possible. First, we have received questions about what do you expect the outcomes of the US election and the new presidential administration to be for these issues on LGBTIQ issues and sexual and reproductive rights, for the global conversation on these issues. And we've also received questions about the issue of asylum and refugees, and whether Sweden's asylum policy and deporting refugees to countries where they may face persecution, to what extent that goes in hand with the feminist foreign policy and the stance on LGBTIQ rights that you outlined.
Thank you very much. Yes, I will try to answer this wide question shortly, because I have to run 4 o'clock for my next meeting, like on my 8th video meeting for today. But starting with the United States, I think that even if Sweden has a good relation with whomever is in the White House, I think that when Trump is giving way to Biden, Kamala Harris administration, a lot of issues will be much more easy because it's much more in line with our policy. And one policy is, of course, the Mexico City policy that is also called the gag rule. It's a policy where that prohibits NGOs which receives United States funding to perform or provide counseling and abortion and those issues. And hopefully that is overturned. That has happened several times before when there have been a change from Republican to Democratic presidency. That have major implication, both financially but also politically, in the world, because it will strengthen sexual and reproductive health and rights, UNFPA, and retract the decision to leave the World Health Organization. So hopefully when it comes to LGBTI persons' enjoyment of human rights, it would be important if the incoming administration would reverse a recent initiative that promote some human rights over others. So some human rights are more important than other human rights. And of course, we will have a reason to come back to this, but I have my hopes. When it comes to the issue of asylum, the fact is that people who feel well-founded fear of perspective due to sexual orientation or gender identity or gender expression have the right to protection in Sweden. It's a Swedish migration agency that has had several assignments to ensure legal quality in the LGBTI cases. They also have competence to be able to make assessment of such cases. One example of this is that in 2019, the authority took measures to terminate the system of LGBTI specialists and move over to a system where all review staff are responsible for the quality of LGBT cases. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to have been able to take part in this very important and interesting discussion. So I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much, Foreign Minister, and thank you so much for taking your time to participate. We will end in just 2 minutes. Time goes very quickly when discussing these issues, but I'll end by giving a few, say, 30 seconds to each of you who are still in here. And is there one thing of today's conversation that you would really stress and that you find really important for the listener, for the audience to take with them? What would that be? Or is there anything that you haven't had time to bring up? Nila, would you, or anyone who would?
Sure. I guess I'll just quickly maybe reinforce what has been said by my colleagues and by myself. There is still a very serious danger of interventions around LGBTQI rights being perceived as colonialist, and that is based on a reality of colonialism that has seriously harmed countries in the global south. And so every intervention has to be ultra conscious of how to not just sidestep the appearance of colonialism, but how to actually contribute to decolonizing and to affirming the autonomy of movements on the ground in the global south and elsewhere.
Thank you. Caroline or Janar? Caroline, would you like to?
Sure, very quickly. I mean, I echo that. We are, as I think any of those the voices who are representing here, we come from space of resistance and movements that have been resisting. And yes, there are horrible things, but we're also resisting and we're resilient. And I think international partners who believe in that need to support and invest in and contribute to strengthening the resistance and resilience of actions of local partners. And that's through our organizing that exists and really listening and responding to that. And it gives me a lot of hope that at ISDAO we've been able to do that by actually supporting the work that community organizations have identified as priorities, but never been able to get funding for because it wasn't seen as a priority for others.
Thank you. Janad?
Yeah, I just, because I also connect to what already been said by Nila and Caroline, and I agree on that, and also would like to mention that COVID time showed that, for example, we all, as activists, we did learn about how, you know, to do activities like researchers or advocacy, but we didn't learn how to be sustainable. I mean, I think we should change that by learning how to be economically stable, because in that difficult time, many trans people, LGBTQ, gay people, we do not have access to just, you know, to sometimes to buy food or something very, very simple. And in all our activities, we couldn't imagine this could happen. And I think we should also reflect and think how we could, I don't know, make something that would be like more socialist, you know, sharing, studying how to be helping to each other without any, like, I mean, without this capitalist view that is everywhere. And I'm very sick of, you know, thinking how we just sometimes fall into structures that exactly capitalist. And in a capitalist structure, you cannot be supportive to each other. You cannot be sharing something. So it's very dangerous, and we should understand that coronavirus was a time, and it's still, I mean, continuing, where we should relearn or be more, you know, stable, helping and sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janad, and thank you everyone, to all our panelists. Thank you so much for taking your time, for raising these important issues, both increasing our awareness about the complexities involved in this work, and pointing at some ways forward. And we could have continued for several hours, I'm sure, but it's past 4. We hope that the conversation continues. I'm sure it does. And thanks again for being here today. The film of this seminar will be available on our website at ui.sc. So you will find it there shortly. Thanks again, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.